Great, welcome back to House Healthcare. We are continuing our conversation on S89, and today we have Department of Mental Health with us. Welcome. So just so you know, we had a review, a section by section review with Legislative Council this morning. Okay. There's still a lot about the commitment process we don't know. Legislative Council is going to talk us through that on Friday, but there might be some questions around there. But really what I'm interested in hearing is the why. What's the purpose? Why? Who are we trying to help? Why this place? All of that good stuff.
Sure, happy to talk about that. And Karen also is well versed in our due process and commitment, both in the civil and criminal justice.
Great.
So I'll start with the why. For the record, Emily Haas, Commissioner for the Department of Mental Health. Thank you for having us here today to talk about this bill. So over the course of the past couple of years, there have been numerous instances, where someone has committed a crime or allegedly committed a crime, and their competency has been in question, and then their sanity has also been in question, which is a defense. And then if they are found incompetent and do not meet hospital level of care and can't necessarily be served in the community adequately, there is a gap in our system for those individuals. And so those individuals.
That's a real question. So I just want to get some of the terminology. So hospital level of care right now would be where?
Anywhere across our hospital system, depending on what their needs are. Most folks, though, who are coming through our system on a competency or sanity evaluation are either going to the Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital, Rutland Regional Medical Center, or Brattleboro Retreat. On occasion, UVM Medical Center will take someone, but primarily it's split between those three hospitals. Those are also the three hospitals that the Department of Mental Health contracts with to serve folks who have the highest treatment needs related to their acuity. And so what this bill proposes is a different level of care. We would look to license this as a therapeutic community residence in order to serve those folks in a treatment setting versus a correctional facility and or an inappropriate community setting.
So why would someone, so we have hospital level, therapeutic,
Yes,
community.
correct.
What's the difference between therapeutic and community?
Great. I'll actually talk about the difference between all three. So hospital level of care is typically a person who needs 24-hour nursing in order to meet their treatment needs. And then when you think about the next level of care, for some folks, that's straight out into their apartments. For other folks, that could be an intensive residential facility, which provides around-the-clock treatment. And they live there for a period of 8 to 16 months, depending on what their treatment needs are. And then we also have our secure residential that is scheduled to be opening and relocating to Essex in May. And the difference between somebody who needs a secure residential and even an intensive residential is that they need that 24-hour treatment, but not necessarily nursing support 24 hours. And then the next step down is independent living. And that independent can look a few ways. That independent living can look like supports coming in and out of one's home if they need that. It can look like engagement in case management services, psychiatric care, so on and so forth. So it runs the gamut of what our outpatient programs offer for someone. If somebody is ordered through the court on an order of non-hospitalization, which is the process that we're looking for this forensic facility, folks can be ordered on an O&H in any of our outpatient programs, whether that's a potential forensic facility, the secure residential, independent living, or other intensive residential programs throughout our system. An order of hospitalization requires somebody to meet hospital level of care in order for a hospital to admit them.
Are there any questions?
Sorry, I know that was
This is a lot. Go ahead, Art.
Emily, how is a forensic facility different? What physically or security-wise is done there that isn't done in these others? Just so I have some understanding.
That's a very good question, actually. So a forensic facility would be physically locked. So the doors would be locked, a fence, and then also the ability for staff to put hands on, or request involuntary medications through the court process. And that is a court process to do that.
Okay, you say put hands on so they can physically restrain.
Correct.
Okay.
Restraint, seclusion. Yeah.
Okay.
That is not a tool in the toolbox for the broader system, only within the inpatient unit system.
Hands-on.
The hands-on
Okay.
and involuntary medication through the board.
Okay, so this is a step up in level of care or level of confinement, I guess you could say.
Yeah, if folks remember, and I know that you weren't here when we did this, but so we'll make sure that we have it. We did a nice pyramid of our systems of care. And the top two levels were our inpatient setting and our secure residential. This is sort of between those two. And potentially the big difference is the ability to petition the court for medication or for staff to do seclusion and restraint if that's necessary.
Okay, the hospital up here that we plan to carve out with this, are they equipped with the secure level that we need, or does that have to be built?
So the hospital, which we're referring to, is Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital. So this bill has the initial placement of a forensic facility within an existing facility. And that is taking 9 hospital beds offline, potentially, and relicensing them as therapeutic community residence beds. The current structure of that building is already a higher level of care, and so it meets those required security security.
So it
approaches.
doesn't take
Yeah.
that much to do it?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
In this proposed legislation, there was an exemption for the CON process. Can you describe what led to that request for an exemption?
I will defer to Karen Barber to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully I see her, yeah.
Karen.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. So this really came about because when we were building the current River Valley, we went through the CON process, and it was really a repeat of what was done in the legislature, right? So the CON process, the idea behind it is that there is a public process, right? So that people can submit comments, can provide testimony, all of the things that happen in the legislature. And so it's duplicative. The other thing is, just like River Valley, if the legislature says we have to do this, then it's really unclear what actual role the CON plays, right? Because they have to grant the CON because the legislature already said we had to do it. So the reason we're asking to be exempted is because we're already going through that public process through this, and they're duplicative. And so there's really no need to do both. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you.
Just to piggyback off of the question before that about what's in the forensics facility, besides the structural pieces, what programs or pieces are inside that program as well?
Sure. So we would operate it very similar to any of our other programmatic opportunities for folks. There's access to a psychologist, psychiatrist, there are mental health specialist staff there, nursing staff. And so they would deliver groups, individual, life skills, all of the things that we currently deliver in other components of our system. Welcome.
So I understand that we have to size down the facility that we have now. But
For
I'm,
IMD.
yes. But I'm wondering, I mean, right now, this population that we're talking about, they're sort of in various different types of facilities that we have.
I would say yes or no. Yes and no. Some are for the forensic population that we would consider for this facility. Some are in corrections. Some are in the community awaiting the outcome of their competency or sanity. Some are currently in the hospital.
So I'm wondering, currently, because these people are sort of embedded in our whole system of care that we have currently, aren't we getting Medicaid dollars?
So for VPCH, they are in an IMD phase down. And so what that means is over the course of several years, up until 2027, VPCH will need to phase down in order to become Medicaid eligible. Medicaid also doesn't cover individuals who are involved in the criminal justice system, which these folks are. We are already paying general fund for 9 beds at the Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital.
Okay.
And so our goal really is to keep this facility at a 25-bed facility. And I think there's a couple of paths to do that. This is one path. And then when we think about the remaining 16 beds at the facility, in order for it to continue being 25 beds, we still need to keep those 16 beds with a length of stay under 60 days in order to keep that a Medicaid eligibility. So it's more about who's in the bed for that drawdown.
So, I mean, I understand that we have to draw down, but I didn't know if we were getting Medicaid dollars now for these people and if we created a designated forensic facility that how we were going to replace that. But it appears you're telling me we're not replacing anything because we're already paying for it.
We're already paying for it. That's why it made sense to do an initial trial of this at a current facility. From my perspective, it's the getting in and getting out that is the most important and likely the most important for our community members because we're committed to have people back into their communities. But there is a gap in our system with this. And so that would be the goal, that somebody gets adequate treatment, stabilized, and out to the least restrictive.
Thank you.
Do other states have forensic facilities?
Yes, most other states do. We're one of a few, there's a handful of states that do not have a forensic facility. But they typically have larger general fund state hospitals. And I think it's great that we don't have a general fund state hospital. I think that goes in line with our deinstitutionalization, but we also don't want folks to be in corrections unnecessarily because we've moved in that direction. And so that is the lens that we're looking at this with.
Okay, just one quick question. Did you raise your hand? One quick question on the IMD. So, but will the federal government, although it's 16 and 9, it's still one building, right? So will the federal government say, oh, well, no, those 16 beds, even if it is under 60 days, really doesn't count because you have these 9 beds over here?
Sure. I think what I would rather did was have actually Berliner, who's our Medicaid policy expert, come in and answer that. There's 2 different lenses of the beds. There's the survey lens, which is your conditions of participation for a facility, your regulation side of CMS, and then there's your payment side of CMS. And so I think Ashley can talk really well about that payment lens, and licensing and protection could talk about the different ways that the participation have allowed for standalone psychiatric facilities to have a distinct and separate part for a different level of care.
Please. Can you clarify a little bit on other states? My understanding was back when we were working on S3 was that we were the only state that did not have the equivalent of a forensic facility or a place to care for people who were criminally accused or involved.
and had behavioral or mental health.
Yeah, I might turn that over to Karen if she remembers what the other states were, but in my mind, it was Alaska was one of them. But I'll ask Karen.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I do remember.
Yeah, we can look that up.
There's very few.
There's very few, and it may be within our forensic work group, notes or something like
I'll
that.
look it up, don't do the work, it's fine.
Art, and then Leslie.
Yeah, and I don't know, Lori, if you're maybe not as good or Alyssa to answer this, but I'm not getting the Medicaid thing. What the dynamic is between beds and.
Sure. So I think there's, and Emily and Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's two issues. One, I think is what Alyssa was bringing up is these people are already in our system of care in some place.
Yeah, yeah.
Are we getting federal Medicaid dollars for that care? And I believe the answer is no, because we do not get Medicaid dollars for people who are in the Department of Corrections.
Yeah.
So that's one issue.
Corrections, okay.
The second issue is we have this IND drawdown. So we have a 25-bed facility. The federal government is saying it can only be 16 beds. And so and I think this started a couple of years ago, until 2027, there's a phase down where the Medicaid dollars we were getting, we're now shifting to general fund dollars until we get to 2027, and we'll be done with that, and it'll be general fund dollars.
Okay.
Unless, and this is where I get a little messed up, unless the stay is for 60 days or less.
Or we take the 9 beds off completely and only have it be a 16-bed facility.
Right.
Which was why I made the comment that we would like to keep a 25-bed facility somehow. And so that is accurate. And I believe there's legislation from Act 79 that requires the commissioner to have drop those beds to 16 if there's not a path forward for Medicaid drop down in order to become Medicaid.
It almost sounds like an administrative thing. I mean, if you've got 25 beds and you're gonna take 9 and make them forensic, which then can't be used with Medicaid, correct?
Correct.
The other 16, so now you've got a 16-bed facility, right?
We have 16 hospital beds, and we'll have to be really careful about who goes in the beds.
Right.
Make sure that we stay under that length.
But those 16 beds will be able to be used for Medicaid patients?
Yes.
Within a whole lot of parameters.
Yeah, that's right.
Which we also just need to really understand.
All right,
that.
okay. I'm just trying to.
Yeah, because so the question in my mind is, you have 16 beds and you have 9 beds. Technically, they're still in the same building. So how does the federal government look at that?
Yeah.
And there's some really, from a conditions of participation lens, that's very clear in that for standalone psychiatric hospitals, you can have a separate and distinct part. And that separate and distinct part is defined by just making sure that one bed isn't a hospital bed and the bed next to them isn't something else. And we believe that the 9 beds at the Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital does meet that distinct and separate requirement.
Is there anything within the bill that requires us to get that from CMS before we move forward?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, fine.
When you talk about that, like I'm trying to imagine what it like actually looks like. Is it that there's just people in the exact same kind of room next to each other, but one person in one room is getting one kind of specialized care and one is another? Or is it literally like there's a hospital bed in here, but like a bunk bed in here? Like,
Well, that's what CMS doesn't want us to do. So
what don't they want us to do?
they don't want you to have a mixed unit of folks who are at different levels of care on one unit. And so how VPCH is set up is there's an 8-bed unit, and then a yard, and then a 4-bed unit and a 5-bed unit. And we're looking at the 4 and the 5-bed units.
So they're like,
They're separate and distinct, but there's not like
Okay.
a wall that separates the two sides of the.
and are they allowed to mingle in common areas?
I do not believe that they can mingle in common areas. We would, and we did this successfully throughout most of the pandemic. We operated our therapeutic residence there for about 2 years during the pandemic, where you assign certain yard times for each side of the house, and that worked.
I'm sorry, I skipped you. I had a feeling I skipped someone. Sorry. Go ahead, Linda.
Could you talk about why 9 beds, statewide forensic beds? Is that because of studies done through judiciary, or how did you determine that? And is it sufficient? As you know, I'm coming from the southern part of the state where we've had some recent troubles. So
I would say that it was less about what does the whole state need and more about what would make the least financial impact on the request. And it's already a staffed program. It already has the security developed and in place. And we believe that we don't want to start with 100 beds. And like I said early on, it's the coming in and the coming out that is most important to me. And so those 9 beds were a good opportunity for us to look at this, move it forward, and get access to a level of care that folks don't currently have access to. And I may turn testimony over to
Yep,
Karen.
that's fine, thank you.
If you're okay
Yep.
with that, and I'll hop downstairs and then
can I ask just
walk
one?
upstairs.
I'm just curious to know what the evaluation is going to be because it seems like you're fitting the bed, you have this structure that you're trying to fit the problem to rather than the problem to a structure.
I would say yes and no, and Karen will be really good at talking about the due process and what the bill proposes to adequately serve those folks coming in and out.
Thanks. And the communities.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Back down there.
Up the count.
Go back.
Karen, so is there a question on the table for Karen? Or you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, Karen, I'll look here.
I know, it's so weird, isn't it? Yeah.
How many people right now, if we open this facility today, open 9 beds, would all 9 beds be occupied, or do we know that? Do we know?
You know,
How many-
I don't think we have a good number because these are not folks that may necessarily be in our system. I think we know of at least 1 or 2 folks on the Dale side that would be appropriate. And I think we know of a couple on the DMH side that would be appropriate. I think the other thing is we wouldn't want to fill it all at once because we would want to make sure ideally there's some flow without the system, but we do certainly know of some individuals right now that we think would be appropriate, both on the DMH and the Dale side.
All right, thank you.
Is this, I forget to look this way? Yeah, Is this primarily for adults or is there an age requirement to access this facility or
Yeah, it would be 18 plus. It would be for adults.
it's not for juvenile?
No.
So Karen, I think what I'm struggling with as, a member of the healthcare committee and the lens we should be looking through is, does this better serve people than the current status quo that we have? And so I guess if you could explain some examples potentially, I don't know how to do it, obviously, can't tell us, specific examples, but I guess what is the difference? So someone is able to be cared for in a forensic facility versus potentially where they are today. What is the benefit to that person?
Well, there's a couple benefits, right? So there's a couple different situations. So it could be that someone never met hospital level of care to begin with. So the hospital was never an option for them. So they're remaining in corrections for a period of time until they can try to figure out some sort of placement for them. A lot of times the community is really unable or unwilling to accept that level of risk. And so they're not in really an appropriate placement, right? So either we can't find a community placement to take them, or it's really not a good fit. It's kind of the most kind of secure we can get it in the community, but it's really not ideal, or there's nothing, right? And so there's not a lot of structure around it. It kind of depends. The other side is if they
Can I just I apologize to interrupt you, but so in that situation, the person has been charged with a crime but has not gone through a trial.
Correct, because either they've been found incompetent, so they can't go to trial, or they've been found insane, which means they can't be held responsible for the crime.
And then how is it, so I'm assuming that's the first step, and then the second step is how you determine hospital level care or not hospital level care. Is that
Correct.
the
Yes.
next? Okay.
Yeah. So what kind of happens now, right, is if there is an issue of competency or sanity, the court can ask for an evaluation. That's either done on an inpatient basis or an outpatient basis. And then once we get the results of the competency evaluation, sometimes the parties stipulate to it, sometimes it's contested, right? So there'll be a court hearing, court makes a determination, or it's stipulated. And at that point, if there is a finding of incompetency or insanity, that's what triggers the commitment hearing into either DMH or jail custody.
Okay, and then the commitment hearing could still be, so is that the hospitalization versus non-hospitalization, or?
It could be. It also could be that hospitalization is never on the table. It could be that Act 248 is on the table, and it could be that nothing's on the table, right? There are some cases where, you know, it's a TBI or dementia. They don't fit into either of our custody, or substance use. Because remember, there's lots of reasons people could be incompetent or insane that are not, it's not just mental illness, right? There's lots of reasons. And so just because they've been found incompetent or insane doesn't mean they necessarily come into our system. Or even if they do have issues of mental illness or developmental disabilities, it doesn't mean that they're acute enough that they need involuntary services.
I guess I'm struggling with, and this isn't really our issue. I don't think, I just think this is judiciary, but then why are they not going through the court process?
Because you can't go through the court process if you're not competent to stand trial. So competency is a threshold issue. If you are not competent, that basically means you can't interact with your attorney or participate in your own defense. They can't bring you to trial. Everything stops until you're competent. So it can't proceed. And then if you are competent, but then are found insane, they can't hold you responsible, right? That's also the end of it. So there is no criminal path at this moment.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry, I just got you way off track there. So you were giving us an example.
Yes.
Of type of people. Okay, sorry. And then I know we have some questions, but let's try to finish the example.
So then it also could be, so on the DMH side, so it could be that you never really met that level of care. It could also be that you were in the hospital, you no longer meet hospital level of care, but again, there's not a good community placement for you because you still need a high level of security. You may need what we call episodic emergency and voluntary procedures. So you could be stable, but you still are showing, there may be still some instances where you do need to be secluded or restrained, or there's a concern that maybe they won't take their medication and their medication is really the key to keeping them stable and doing well. Currently, the Middlesex facility, which will in less than a month be River Valley, you know, we had originally asked for the ability to do these things in River Valley, and the determination of the legislature was not to allow us to do that. So that does limit who can go in there. So they can't, so some of these folks can't transition to River Valley because it doesn't have, I think as Emily said, the tools in the toolbox they may need to safely serve these folks, right? Because there is, in some of these cases, I also think it's important to remember, we're talking about a small subset of the population, right? We're not talking about everybody with mental illness. We're not talking about everybody with a developmental disability. We are talking about people who are charged with crimes so serious that they're held without bail. It's a pretty narrow group of people, right? So I think that's important to remember because there's a lot of talk about trying to institutionalize people and do all that. We need to remember we're talking about a very small group of people with very high needs. And so that's why they do need some extra structure around them. There is that public safety component. And so sometimes we do need to assure we have the proper mechanisms to safely not just serve them, but also the people they're in the facility with.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And then Art.
So I wrote a bunch of things down, but I was also listening to you, so it's just chaotic. So I'm just looking at it and trying to simplify it. So are there any situations where a person who was considered incompetent to stand trial, or I don't like using the word, but like legally insane, are there any cases where they would not require hospitalization and be based in the community?
Oh, more often than not, they don't require hospitalization.
So if a person committed a crime that hurt other people, they could be just placed in the community?
Yeah, because remember, the system we have right now, you have to have a mental illness acute enough that you require involuntary care. And then I'm not the best person to talk about Act 248, but I understand that the guardrails around that are also pretty narrow, right? So I think when we're looking at the statutes as a whole and DMH, right, our mandate from the legislature is to serve people in the least restrictive setting possible. And our mandate is to really assure personal autonomy, right? It is a high threshold to involuntarily hospitalize someone in Vermont. It is, some would say, harder in Vermont than other places, right? And that was a decision, a policy decision that was made. So it does mean that certainly there are folks that are found incompetent or insane that don't meet those levels. I think it's also important to remember a lot of the competency and sanity evals we do are for misdemeanors, right? These are not necessarily serious crimes. I do think if you're talking about someone who we're talking about, right? So someone who is held without bail, they're in jail, and then we're trying to figure out a safe place if they don't meet hospitalization to put them after. But just remember, we're talking about a wide variety of charges.
Yeah, I guess I was specifically thinking of situations where people have hurt other people, not like minor misdemeanors. I guess one would say stealing something's hurting someone, but I meant physically harming, like violence. Are there people who are violent who either are deemed incompetent or insane who are not hospitalized and just based in the community without any support?
Well, absolutely, there are people that are not hospitalized. Generally, if they meet criteria to be in our custody, they could be on an order of non-hospitalization. And even those are technically involuntary orders. They really depend on people voluntarily engaging in treatment. But again, people could be incompetent or insane due to substance use. There's no involuntary treatment for that, right? There's no place they can go that's secure where you're kind of keeping them until they deal with that. Or if someone has a TBI, they're not going to come into our custody. They may not be appropriate for Act 248 either, right? So certainly there are folks that don't fit neatly into the systems. This doesn't solve everything. This is meant to solve kind of a current issue that we're seeing, but it's certainly not an all-encompassing solution.
Okay, and so how many people are currently incarcerated who might be better served in the forensic bed or in secure residential or some other kind of transitional or supportive housing? Do we know that?
So we don't know that. And so I think it's important to remember that who is eligible for this facility. So if someone's already been sentenced and is serving their time in corrections, they wouldn't be eligible to go into this system, right? They would remain in corrections. However, if at some point after their sentence, they decompensate to the point where they actually need inpatient mental health care, there's a process. They would come in through the civil system, right? So we've trained DOC staff. They would begin the emergency exam process, and they would come into our custody during the time that they needed to be hospitalized, and then they would be released back to DOC. So those post-sentence folks would not be eligible. In terms of who is there now, it's hard to know, right? Because it means we don't have the results of their competency or sanity evals, so we don't know. If they're found competent, they'll remain there pursuant to whatever their conditions of release are until they're tried. It's only once we get that finding of incompetency that that triggers this process to think about where they need to be held. But if they're competent, they remain in corrections if that's what their bail is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm realizing as you talk that we're talking about very, very small, tiny piece of the mental health system, and that there's like it's just hitting me how bad it is. You know, how bad the problem is of people not getting the support they need. But we're not here for that right now. So I'll just sit with that and like feel my sadness.
Do we know if there's anyone that is sitting in a correctional facility that should not be there because we do not have a forensic facility?
On the Dale side, I can't say for sure on the DMH side, but we do know of at least one person on the Dale side who is in corrections right now who would, we feel, be better served in this facility. And there's not, because that person does not have a mental illness, it isn't someone that can come into our system. There is really no other secure setting, but they do require a secure setting. And that is current.
Who determines whether a person is ready for what facility? The court?
It's a multi-part process, right? So I can talk about currently and then the proposal for this, or do you just want to know about this one?
No, current would be good too.
Yeah.
Current and then the proposal.
Right.
Okay, perfect. So I can talk to the DMH side, not really the Dale side, but okay. So if someone comes into the DMH system, so what we do is we get the competency and sanity evaluations. And if someone's found incompetent and or insane, we as a team, a clinical team of DMH leadership, review those and determine based on the reasons why they are incompetent or insane, if it makes sense for them to come into our system. Some of them are already in our system, right? Some of them are in the hospital, and so they're already in the system. Some of them are not. And so we would agree to an order of non-hospitalization for those folks. So the commissioner is the one that's making the initial determination about whether or not we think it's appropriate, but then the court makes the final decision. We say we think this, and so the court has to decide if they agree that it's the least restrictive setting. So it's kind of a two-part process. Does that make sense?
Yep.
But who decides the original incompetency?
Oh, the incompetency piece? Right. Well, so that also kind of depends. So it could be that we get an order of or we get an evaluation of competency and both sides agree and they stipulate to the incompetency. But it could be that, one report says incompetent, another report says competent, and they argue it out in court, basically, right? They each present their own witnesses, and then the court makes the ultimate decision about what they think.
Okay. And so then what's the proposed process here?
So the proposed process is that, and again, it's for that narrow group of folks who have been found incompetent or insane and are being held without bail. So their charges are serious enough that the bail is withheld, right? So those are, generally murders and things like that. So the process would change a little bit from now, and that instead of just having the commissioners kind of make the determination about whether or not they want to file, this panel, an AHS panel made up of not just DMH, but also Dale and DOC, and the secretary would kind of look at the panel and look at the person and looking under two criteria, because the important thing is they still need to meet, if they're coming in under DMH custody, the Title 18 criteria, which is in 7101, and that's a person in need of treatment or a person in need of continuing treatment. So they still need to meet that threshold of actually requiring that level of treatment. On the Dale side, it's in the Act 248.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. So they would make a recommendation about whether or not so they look at clinical, but then they also look at the public safety concerns. And the public safety concerns is really tied to the least restrictive, right? So threshold clinically, Do they need that level of care? And then you're looking at the dangerousness factors to really, again, think about, is it the least restrictive? Because that's not just Vermont law, right? That's the ADA and the Olmstead decision on a federal level. We have a requirement to serve people in the least restrictive setting possible. So we've kind of tried to spell out in S89, what are kind of the factors we're looking at when we're thinking about what is the least restrictive. So once the committee makes a recommendation, one of the things they have to take into consideration is the position of the party. So that gives the state's attorneys the ability to let us know what they think, gives the defender general, and it gives the victim if they want. Those are not necessarily going to be followed, right? Because again, it needs to be a part of that clinical threshold. And then we have to make that least restrictive analysis, but it gives a voice. I think what we've heard a lot from victims and from the state's attorneys is they come into our system and they don't know what's going on. And there's kind of an information void, and victims want to feel heard. So we're trying to strike a balance between respecting the rights of the people who are coming into our system because of their mental health needs or developmental disability needs and the rights of the victims. And so this kind of the compromise language in terms of letting them give the recommendation to the panel allows that. So the panel makes the recommendation to the custodial commissioner. So if it's a Dale case, they would make the recommendation to the Dale commissioner. If it's DMH, to the DMH commissioner. Those custodial commissioners, because they are the custodial commissioners and hold the liability, have to make the final determination about whether or not they agree with the panel and whether or not they're going to petition the court. If they do petition the court, they follow the same process as they do now. So if we want to send someone to Middlesex or River Valley, it is an order of non-hospitalization because it's not a hospital, but it's a higher level of care because it's physically secure. And so it's a special kind of ONH. The court has to make a special finding, and DMH has to prove that there's no least restrictive setting possible. And the court specifically has to find that they agree that there is no least restrictive setting. This is very similar, right? So the panel would make the recommendation, the commissioner would decide. If the commissioner does decide, they would petition the court and they would say, for these reasons, and they would include the recommendation of the panel, we feel like the forensic facility is the least restrictive setting to serve this person. And then the court makes the ultimate decision about, yes, we agree, or the court could say, no, I think actually this person could be served in the community. I think there is a less restrictive. And during this process, just like in the process now, the person actually has two attorneys. So they'll have their defender general, generally, they could have private counsel, but often it's the defender general's office. And once competency and sanity comes into play, S3 made it so that legal aid was appointed. So they'll also have a legal aid attorney. So throughout this process, they have two attorneys, and the attorneys can also argue in court. So say DMH is asking for the forensic facility or asking for Middlesex, their attorneys can argue against that and say, no, DMH hasn't met the burden. This is not the least restrictive setting. And so then the court will take that and decide. More often than not, we stipulate, and I'm guessing that will likely be what happens with the new facility, but certainly there are some cases where it's contested and the court is making the ultimate decision.
How long does all of this take? My question.
There's a lot of due process built into every step of our system.
Yeah.
It depends. So generally, currently right now, so if someone's found incompetent or insane, I think by statute, it's 15 days that the court has to hold the commitment hearing. Sometimes that can be extended. So sometimes legal aid may want to ask, say we're going to ask for a certain level of care and legal aid doesn't agree with it. They can go out and get an independent evaluation, so they can get their own psychiatrist to see their client. And so it could be a contested hearing. Again, more often than not, we're stipulating, so it actually doesn't take that long because both sides are kind of agreeing to the level of care that's needed. If it goes to hearing, it could take a little bit longer, especially to give legal aid the time to get their independent eval.
And why are we changing the rules? Or why are you suggesting we change the rules?
I think because we heard feedback from the state's attorneys and the victims that they didn't feel like in this narrow set of cases, not talking about everyone, but talking about these narrow cases where they're very serious crimes, they felt like they didn't have a voice and they felt like they didn't know what was happening because not only by statute, Vermont statute 18 BSA 7103, but also under HIPAA, these proceedings, once they're in family court, they're confidential, right? Because we're talking about protected health information. So the victims and this don't necessarily know what's happening, and that's understandably difficult. S3 made some changes that did talk about notification in certain instances. But I think what we've heard a lot from is that there's still a feeling that there's not enough information that they have. So again, I think we were trying to strike a balance between giving some limited information, but also protecting the rights of the folks who are the subject of these proceedings. Because again, we're talking about their mental health or their health. So it's kind of it was an attempt to compromise.
Okay. Frank?
I get the part about the least restrictive setting, but the part that I'm still struggling with is serving people. Because like as a healthcare worker, I feel like what I see more common than not is like lots of homeless, like unhoused people not getting services, not receiving, and you know, I'm speaking like about clients and others that I know in the community, and then ending up in trouble and bouncing between jail and homelessness. And I'm just curious, like, what are these services that we're supposed to be providing to people across these settings exactly? Or is there no requirement? We're just supposed to do something and we kind of figure it out.
You mean what services would be in the facility?
I guess I get where you're coming from, but I think we're talking about two different sets of people.
Except that it's a failure to take care of people that gets them into a forensic facility, you know? So I'm curious,
Right,
like,
so
it's okay if we don't need to get into it today. I'm just sitting here feeling like this is bringing up a lot of the bigger picture stuff, you know? And it's like, I guess the services, maybe you could say like, here's the specific services we provide in the forensic facility, and you don't have to get into what we should be doing outside, you know, or in jails or anywhere else, you know.
And are you saying services within the forensic facility that make them ready to come back into the community at some point?
Or evaluate their competency or stabilize them so they can go to court, you know, like what is that? Like, what are the services? Like, is there group therapy? Is there, you know, occupational therapy? Is there, you know, any kind of trauma-informed treatment? Is it just medication? Is it a psychological exam? Like, maybe you could just focus on that, and I'll let everything else go right now that people need.
Okay. I will just say though, to touch on yours, so we do contract with the designated agencies. There's what we call master kind of contract agreements that kind of lay out everything that the designated agencies need to provide. I will just note that our outpatient system is really voluntarily based, right? So people, if they don't meet the high threshold for involuntary care, they need to choose to engage in treatment. So I'll just say that if you want particulars on what's in the master grant, we can certainly get you a copy of that. Those are public agreements. You can certainly see that. In terms of the forensic facility, so part of that is kind of still being developed, right? So we anticipate it being licensed as a therapeutic community residence, and the statute requires that. River Valley and MTCR are also licensed as therapeutic community residences, so those are overseen by Dale. There are lots of TCRs across the state. MTCR, when it was created, we amended the rule to add a special section to deal with that, because all other TCRs can't be locked, right? So there's certain things, Middlesex, that we had to carve out, but the rule itself is maybe 30 pages, and it sets out a lot of criteria in terms of what kind of care has to be provided and all of that stuff. So there is criteria. We do anticipate, and the bill contemplates needing to amend the TCR rule again to allow and create a section for this new facility. So it would kind of lay out again the kind of the quality metrics, but also would make exceptions from the general rules to allow it to be locked, to allow involuntary medication, and to allow emergency and voluntary procedures. In terms of treatment, it will be very similar to what folks can get at River Valley, although folks with DD and ID issues would have kind of more tailored. The thing is, a lot of folks already now are co-occurring, so we are serving this population, but certainly there will be some training and some more targeted programming needed. So when you come into a facility, right, there's at River Valley, so there's and it would be set up very similar. There's a psychiatrist, so there is kind of an overall psychiatry portion of it. There's social workers, there's psychologists, there's recovery specialists. So there's different levels of care. It's 24/7 care, there's nursing staff. So it's much more than just medication management. If that's not everyone takes medications, right? Some people do though. And so that's a part of it. There's group therapy, individual therapy. So it really kind of depends on their different needs. I think we gave a presentation, the Green Mountain Care Board, when we were getting our CON for River Valley, that really kind of talked about all the different things they do, but it's very person-centered. So everyone has their own treatment plan and really tailor their needs to them. But I think Vermont is fairly unique in that we have psychologists on staff in a lot of these facilities, which allow us to be able to provide kind of an even higher level, I would say, of programming than just psychiatrists. But I'm not clinical. So if you have like specific clinical questions, you probably want to talk to someone else.
Great, thanks, Karen. Art?
Yeah, I'm trying to digest all that you're telling us. It sounds like these folks that will go into the forensic centers are people who could be very violent. They could be some of the toughest cases you can have, who probably committed murder or something like it, and that. Since we don't have this facility today, is the public safe today from these folks, and will it be safe if we have a forensic facility from these folks getting loose and attacking? I just want to make sure that we're not compromising that of anything we're doing. So.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I would say that, no custodial commissioner can guarantee safety at all times, right?
I understand.
Yeah. So in terms of elopement, so we've never had anyone elope from VPCH, which is where we initially expect this to be. Elopements are pretty rare. These are locked facilities. It would be, we have had a couple elopements from MTCR, but those were years ago. We've made a lot of changes, not just to the fence, but to kind of our assessment in terms of when people go out into the community. So I would say the risk of elopement is pretty low. It's not zero, but it's pretty low at VPCH. So you need both a badge and a key. So even if, say someone was able to grab somebody's badge and try to run, they still couldn't get out without a key. You need both. So I would say it's pretty secure, that the risk of that is pretty low. In terms of right now, I think everyone does their best to build programming around folks who require that level of care, but I do think it's a gap in the system, which is why we put this forward. Okay, so
we're pretty safe. I didn't know, so you say you hadn't known of anyone who escaped? Did I hear you say that?
No one has eloped from the Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital. Elopements from hospitals are pretty rare. EDs are a little different, right? They don't have the same security. But again, I would say elopements are fairly rare, but they do happen.
Any other questions for Karen right now? We're gonna come back to this. Thank you, Karen, very much. Yeah. We will reach back out with questions.
Actually, maybe
Oh, hold on, wait, we might have one more.
Is there any reason not to do that?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
So.
From our perspective, I think we've worked really hard to try to work with stakeholders to come up with a proposal that meets a need. Obviously, not everyone agrees, right? This is a really tough topic. And these things are hard. We spent 18 months at the forensic work group and really just couldn't reach consensus on much because these are real philosophical divides amongst different folks. And so we tried really hard to listen to everything everyone had to say, to consider their ideas. And then we worked together with our Dale partners in AHS, the state's attorneys, and the Attorney General's office to really think about what is a potential solution for this. And so again, it's not the perfect solution. It's not going to fix everything, but we do feel like it is something that the legislature should pass. We do think it will make a real impact on the system. And so yes, I do think that you should pass it. I don't think that there's a reason not to, given that, again, it's a real narrow group we're targeting, right? I think that's important to remember. We're not trying to bring back mass institutionalization. That is absolutely not our goal. People aren't going to live at the forensic facility. It is not a place someone goes and lives, right? There will be continually reassessments by the court at least once a year. The person's attorney can at any time say, I don't think they meet this criteria anymore. So there's lots of due process built in. That was really a goal of ours, to make sure at every level there was due process, the person had an attorney. And so I do think that we've put forward the best we can right now. And I think it does make sense given the needs of the system.
Hey, I did read the forensics report, and it was really hard to read that there was no consensus at all. So should we pass this bill, what kind of pushback are we going to get, and where is that going to come from?
So I'm not sure that's a question for Karen.
That's my question.
Those who are listening, if there's pushback, we should hear from them.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious about that.
Alyssa will have the last question.
I guess my question is it's slightly an extension. We have a facility already that is equipped. We have to get that facility down to 16 beds. If we don't pass this, what are we going to do with the rest of that facility?
That's a good question. I think if the legislature decided this was not the way they wanted to go, we would kind of go back to the drawing board and think about what other populations or gaps there are in the system that we may use it for.
Why wouldn't we use it for what it was built for?
Oh, we could, but then we would be paying the full cost of it.
I get that. I get that. Yeah.
And
What I gather on this film is it's being done for a specific reason, and it begins with M. Medicaid funding.
So I guess I would push back a little bit on that and say that it's not being done because of Medicaid funding. The timing works out, right? That we happen to be in phase down, but we were using those beds anyway right now and just paying general fund. We could do that. The word isn't, we made sure that it said initially BPCH because we do want to keep it flexible so that it doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be at BPCH. And if at some point it makes sense to go back up to 25 beds at BPCH, we can do that. The goal is really right now to just think about the needs throughout the system. It's not necessarily a permanent solution, it's location. We've tried to leave that flexible.
Okay, so we have to end very shortly. So a couple quick questions. I'm going to let Melanie go because she hasn't really asked any questions yet, Art.
So just to piggyback off of that last question about what about the facility and the use of it, we hear in the news about shortages for psychiatric beds and the need for more of them. Are those the beds that we're talking about that we're now taking beds away from? Or like that, I'm just curious about, because you hear that a lot.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I would say mostly no. So when most of the people waiting in emergency departments on any given day are either voluntary, so they're seeking voluntary beds, or they are involuntary, but they're not level 1. So VPCH is a level 1 facility. All of its beds are level 1. That means that it's the highest acuity beds in the system. So VPCH has 25 level 1 beds. There's 6 at Portland and there's 26 at Brattleboro Retreat. All of the other 100 and some odd beds throughout our system are not level 1 beds, they're general beds. So someone who's waiting in the ED either voluntarily or just even involuntarily, but not needing an acute level of care, wouldn't be eligible for VPCH anyway, because those beds, again, are really reserved for the most acute. We do think, though, that there are folks who, because we do anticipate that there would be some folks right now being served on level 1 units that would transition to the forensic unit, that would open up flow within the level 1 unit so that people who really did need to get into it could. And then hopefully it would help the system as a whole. We do expect, hopefully, now that River Valley will come online soon, that increases from 7 to 16 beds, that should free up some flow in the system. So it's not going to necessarily take away, but we do hope it will overall contribute to helping the flow of the system.
All right, you got the final one. For real this time.
I thought I heard you say that this isn't a long-term situation for folks, but if someone's gone to trial and found to be, insane, and had to go to a facility, would they not stay in this facility until they were not insane or whatever? I mean,
Yeah, that's a great question. So it would depend on their clinical presentation, right? So there could be people that are there for a really long time. There are some folks at MTCR or VPCH that have been there for a really long time. But the goal is to never keep people forever, right? The goal is to transition people to a lower level of care and ultimately back into the community. It depends solely on their clinical presentation. But certainly, yes, someone could be sick enough that it does require that high level of care for years.
okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Karen, very much. Appreciate your time.
Of course.
So we're done for the day and we'll be back here at 9 a.m. We're taking up S47. Right, Claire?
We go.
Yes.